Hello and welcome. This time we're moving into the 19th century. The 19th century has been called the Protestant Century. We're going to look at why. Here's where we are on the timeline. This is our 5th class out of 9. And next week I won't be producing a video. It's spring break. Okay. So if you looked at the church in 1789, which was when the government of the United States began to function under the United States Constitution, if you looked at the church then, it would be pretty difficult to imagine that the 1800s would be the Protestant century. The churches were really disorganized at the end of the Revolutionary War, especially where the fighting had been the most intense. And the role of Christianity in this new nation, in this new culture, was anything but secure. Formal church membership was shrinking, and it reached an all-time low in the 1790s. Only 5 to 10% of the population were church members. But the church rapidly overcame the confusion of the Revolutionary era, and they mounted these vigorous campaigns for evangelization and Christianizing civilization. And this was done by both the older colonial era type churches, but even more so by some newer dynamic leaders of new denominations. In the 1800s, there was a growing religious pluralism in our country. It wasn't just Protestants, but it was the century of evangelical Protestantism's greatest sway, greatest influence in society of all of our history. That leads us into talking about the Second Great Awakening. So there was no single event like that at Northampton, Massachusetts, in Jonathan Edwards Church, where the First Great Awakening started. No single event or place. And there was no one individual like George Whitefield as the driving force of the Second Great Awakening. But from the 1790s all the way through the mid-1800s, and even through the Civil War and after the Civil War, there was this unprecedented expansion of Protestant churches in the United States, and the striking growth in Protestant influence in our country. And during this time, there were waves of revival until after the Civil War. And all of these waves made up the most influential revival of Christianity in US history, and possibly even one of the most striking examples in all of Christian history, just wave after wave. So we call it the Second Great Awakening, but it was really probably much more expansive than just, one thing, one Great Awakening. It was wave after wave of that. In the late 1790s, some church leaders began to really pray for a revival, for the renewal of the churches. Remember, I said that they were in kind of a bad way. And in 1801, their prayers bore some spectacular fruit. So it was in August 1801, there was a great camp meeting held at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. And thousands of people streamed to it. You can see in this image here, this picture, tents along the outside, and people actually came and tented out and spent like their vacation there. And this became a common occurrence in the first half of the 1800s, these camp meetings. So they came to hear preachers, they came to hear Black preachers, they came to hear white preachers, they came to hear Presbyterian preachers, Baptist preachers, and Methodist preachers. They came to hear all of these different preachers proclaim the gospel, and they proclaimed it with a lot of energy and fervor. And the results were electrifying. So both in terms of emotional response and also in terms of conversions, but also very significantly, there were spectacular results in terms of the rapid establishment of new churches that followed this camp meeting and subsequent camp meetings. There was a rapid growth in Presbyterianism in the South, but that paled in comparison to the growth, the spectacular growth in Baptist churches and Methodist churches. And I've mentioned this before in an earlier talk, but by the 1830s, the Baptists and the Methodists had replaced the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians as the largest denominations in the whole of the United States. So both the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening phenomenon were similar in terms of there was a concern for personal salvation. That was the main thrust and theme of both of them. But there were some differences. So first of all, I've mentioned this, it's who was actually leading and preaching. So in the First Great Awakening, it was Anglicans. John Whitefield was an Anglican, and it was Presbyterians and Congregationalists. So the old Puritan churches. In the Second Great Awakening, it was by far the Baptists and the Methodists. And the other thing that was different between the first and the second was that the second left a more lasting legacy. And one of the reasons that happened, besides the fact that there was a proliferation of new churches, another thing that happened with all of this renewed religious enthusiasm that came out of these waves of revival was a profusion of voluntary societies. And what I mean by voluntary societies are organizations that are created outside of the church, and you can belong to whichever ones you want. You can give to whichever ones you want. So it's voluntary, as opposed to your church membership, which would be considered more, this is your church, and this is kind of like more mandatory. This is your church, and this is where your tithes go. But other giving and other membership, you could belong to any of these. And this is just a tiny sample, these 5 that I have represented here, just a tiny sample of the scores of voluntary societies that sprang up in the first third of the 19th century. And they can all be traced back to this revival energy. So here we have the American Board for Foreign Missions. We have the American Bible Society. We have the American Sunday School Union. We have the American Tract Society. We have the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance related to alcohol. And all of these and all of the other institutions gave Christianization a longer-lived institutional influence that the First Great Awakening hadn't produced. I just want to spend a minute on Sunday school. So the 19th century saw the start of the phenomenon of Sunday school. Sunday school was actually started in Britain at the end of the 1700s, and it was a place where poor children could come to learn how to read and write. And it soon spread to America, and denominations began energetically creating Sunday schools for the same purpose. Children would learn how to read and write, and they'd use the Bible for that. But they'd also be taught basic principles of the Christian faith and Christian spiritual practices and Christian virtues and that sort of thing. By the mid-1800s, Sunday school attendance was a new universal aspect of childhood. There was Sunday school prize days and Sunday school parades and Sunday school picnics, and everybody sent their children to Sunday school. In the 1870s, compulsory state education for children was established, but Sunday school didn't go away. Its curriculum just changed to religious education. But parents continued to think of Sunday school as an essential component of childhood and sent their children to Sunday school. And in America, the first national Sunday school effort began in 1824, and its stated purpose was to organize, evangelize, and civilize. And for the next 100 years until the 20s and in the 20th century, for the next 100 years, and Sunday school was an extremely important outreach arm of the church, and it expanded to include all ages. And by the late 1800s, the end of the century, Sunday school was looked to actually as the main hope for church growth. And that view continued until the middle of the 20th century. So Sunday school. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the Second Great Awakening and characteristics of it and people. So one thing I wanted to mention was the fact that the theology of the later revival differed from the earlier theology. So Edwards and Whitefield of the First Great Awakening were Calvinists, believed in predestination, some to be saved, some to be lost, that sort of thing. But the leading revivalists in this new 19th century revival held a theology that God had bestowed on everybody the ability to come to Christ. And the two individuals that probably embody this Second Great Awakening most were Francis Asbury and Charles Finney. And I'll talk just a little bit about both of them. So Francis Asbury, pictured here, was an Englishman, actually. And he traveled over more of America than probably anybody else did in his generation. And he did it all pretty much on horse. So he was a Methodist, and he knew John Wesley back in England. And John Wesley was the Englishman who had founded Methodism, the movement called Methodism. And John Wesley called for volunteers to go to America to preach and be Methodist missionaries in America. And Francis Asbury, felt that preachers should go wherever the need was greatest. So he volunteered and he set off to America, and he set the model for itinerant Methodist preachers, which is what he did, going around on horseback and traveling around is what Methodist ministers after him tended to do. And he said, go into every kitchen and shop, address all, aged and young, on the salvation of their souls. That was his mission, and that kept him on the move for the rest of his life. He traveled about 300,000 miles back and forth across this country, and like I said, on horseback. When he came to America in 1771, there were 4 Methodist ministers and about 200 Methodists. But when he died in 1816, about 45 years later, there were 2,000 Methodist ministers and about 200,000 Methodists in this country. Okay, as John Asbury and the Methodists. Also, I want you to note that there was also a burst of Baptist energy and Baptist growth, especially in the southern and the western states. And now we move to the other most significant figure of the Second Great Awakening period in the early 1900s, Charles Finney. Charles Finney was a Presbyterian. Look at that penetrating gaze. He was very tall and had this intense look, very powerful speaker. And one of the things about Finney is, more than any other individual of his day, he succeeded in joining evangelical religion with social reform. So, for instance, he was an intense abolitionist trying to get rid of slavery. He called slavery our great national sin, and he refused to give communion to anybody who was a slaveholder. He also pioneered coeducation, and he helped form Oberlin College. That's a picture of a building at Oberlin College there on the top right. That's in Ohio, and it's was the first, and it's the oldest coeducational college in the United States. And it was also part of the Underground Railroad, which helped slaves escape from the South. He was a reformer in terms of temperance or alcohol abuse, in terms of keeping the Sabbath, also in terms of care of the mentally handicapped. So really, salvation, personal salvation, individual salvation, but also social responsibility and social reform. He pioneered a couple of techniques, revival techniques that we still have the legacy of. So one was the anxious bench, a place for sitting near the front where the preacher was, and you could go if you were anxious about the state of your soul. And that actually transformed into the modern evangelical practice of calling people forward to come forward to the front of the church, the sanctuary at the end of the service if they wanted to be saved, if they had a desire for salvation. So he pioneered that. He also pioneered these protracted revival meetings where they would go on for days or weeks. And he also allowed women to pray in mixed public meetings. Okay. So the early 19th century revival that we've been talking about brought women to the visible forefront of the church and to some extent to public life in general. During the First Great Awakening in Puritan New England, men and women had come to join the church in roughly equal numbers. But after that time, after the First Great Awakening and up to the 1800s, women predominated in church membership by far, although not in leadership. But as social conditions were changing, more opportunity for Christian women opened up. And I just want to give you these few examples just as examples. So this is Phoebe Palmer on the left. She was a Bible teacher who longed for a deeper experience of faith. And on July 27, 1837, she received a special sense of the Holy Spirit's indwelling power. And she started these what she called Tuesday meeting for the promotion of holiness. And she had a ministry with her husband of counseling and publishing and public speaking. And she traveled in the United States and also Canada and Britain. She wrote a book called The Promise of the Father, which was a vigorous defense of women's right to preach. In the middle here, we have Catherine Beecher, who was a Christian educator, American educator, and she had really strong views on women getting educated. And she started a girls' school. She even wrote the textbooks for the girls. And you can thank Catherine Beecher for physical education, for PE being included in the curriculum. Her sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a huge abolitionist, anti-slavery novel and a great influence. And then finally, we have here Antoinette Brown. So before Antoinette Brown, women, both Black women and white women, had preached. But hers was the first time that a woman had been formally ordained in America. And this was in 1853 in a congregational church. And I want to just briefly introduce you to these three other women to point out two themes. So one of them is just this continuing on with this theme of this increasing spiritual authority being had by women. We'll see that here. But also there's a second theme, and that's there's ever increasing diversity in religious movements in the United States. It's a theme in U.S. religious history. If you don't like anything you see, create something new. And we saw a lot of that in the 1800s. So these three women started religious movements, although to a greater or lesser degree, we don't really quite recognize them as Orthodox. So Ann Lee on the left started the Shakers. Ellen White, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Ellen White in the middle started the Seventh-day Adventists, which is probably the movement that's, of all the ones that I'm going to mention, closest to what we think of as Orthodox. And then Mary Baker Eddy, who was born in Bow, New Hampshire, and started the Christian Science movement. Also some men, continuing with this theme of starting something new, this American phenomenon. So here's Joseph Smith, who started the Mormons, or the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Here's William Miller. He had started out as a Baptist, then he became a deist, somebody who, if you remember, a deist doesn't believe that God is involved in the world and through Christ and all of that. But then he converted back to being a Baptist, and his friends challenged him to, why did you do that? So he started studying the Bible verse by verse, And as he studied, he became convinced that the time of Christ's second coming is revealed in Bible prophecy. And he figured it out to be October 12th, 1844. And this became a national movement. It was called Millerism. And the people followed his ideas and his teaching across all the different denominations. There were Methodists, Baptists, all the denominations who were Millerites. Unfortunately, October 12th, 1844 came and went, and it was known as the Millerites' Great Disappointment. That impulse to predict the coming of Christ and other future events hasn't gone away. And I don't have a picture up here, but another person from the same time period, this 1800s, is Charles Russell, who started the Jehovah's Witnesses. So all of these things all of these movements are around the world, but they all started in the United States. In this first century, the first century after our independence, I'm just struck by this remarkable phenomenon of religious life in the United States, with this birth of several movements that they so differed from traditional Christianity that they're called new religions. And this is an American thing. Okay, moving back to people who seem more orthodox to us. One of the features of the evangelical mobilization of the 1800s with long-range consequence was this new vision for missionary work. And it emerged in the early 1800s. Protestant missions actually started in England, slightly before America. And the English in 1793 sent William Carey to India. But Americans followed soon after that. And it's interesting. It's an interesting story how it started. This enthusiasm for missions work began after a period of revival at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and it soon spilled over onto students at Andover Theological Seminary here in Mass, which was the nation's first full-fledged school for theological education. So Samuel J. Mills in the middle here, he was a student at Williams, and he and several other students were out one afternoon, and a summer rainstorm came upon them unexpectedly, and they took shelter at a farmyard, and they were actually being sheltered by a haystack. And the students had a prayer meeting in that haystack, and they committed themselves to taking the gospel across the seas. Now, Mills went on to Andover Seminary, and there he created a more formal organization to help them meet their missionary goals. And by 1812, this group had commissioned and sent their first 5 American missionaries to India and the Far East. And among the first 5 that went were Adoniram Judson and his wife, Anne. And Adoniram was a missionary to Burma for nearly 40 years and very greatly revered figure among Protestants. Wonderful biography to read. And then finally, we'll look at an example of bringing Christianity to the Cherokee indigenous people of Georgia. So the Cherokee had sided with the British during the Revolutionary War. So after the war was over, the United States exacted some retribution from them. But after there was a peace treaty was signed in 1794, and then white missionaries began to work among the Cherokee Native Americans. And the Cherokees began to build their own society. They started building roads. They rendered their language into writing, and they started printing books and newspapers. They started organizing politically, like in imitation of whites. And there were 2 processes going on with the Cherokee. One was Christianization through these missionaries, and the other one was cultural conversion. So they really tried to become like the white culture. And Elias Boudinot is a good example of that cultural conversion. He's a Cherokee Indian. but he ended up going to school at Andover Theological Seminary. And then he went back to Georgia and worked in the Cherokee Nation as a translator and a writer and a publisher among his people. So they really had a very quote unquote white culture. Unfortunately, tragically, well, first, before I talk about the tragic, the good was that they invited a lot of missionaries into their civilization, into their culture, missionaries from a lot of different denominations. And there was this slow but steady acceptance of Christian faith. Unfortunately, tragically, despite all of their efforts at becoming part of the dominant culture, they were forcibly removed from Georgia out to the west because gold was discovered in North Georgia. And President Andrew Jackson gave their land to gold-hungry settlers, and he forcibly removed them. The missionaries tried to stop this, actually. Georgia enacted a law that said all white people and missionaries, all white people had to get out of that Cherokee area before the removal happened. But a lot of missionaries just disobeyed that, even to the point of going to jail, trying to protect them. But they ended up being forcibly removed, and they were part of what's known as the Trail of Tears from 1836 to 1839, where the Cherokees and other Native American groups were forcibly removed from their traditional lands. But let me summarize. This is a quote from A History of Christianity by Mark Knoll, just to get a sense of, or just a summary of evangelical America in the period up to the Civil War. In the period before the Civil War, the influence of religion on public life exercised by evangelicals in the United States was so profound and extensive as to be unmatched in the North American context by anything but the situation in overwhelmingly Catholic Quebec. Protestant evangelicals had enormous influence and sway during this century. We get to the middle of the 1800s, we get to the Civil War. This is going to be the big story for my next talk when we talk about this 1800s through the lens of race. I'm going to look at that next time. But after the Civil War, there were lots of changes in terms of growing religious pluralism. There were social changes, economic developments. Again, in terms of pluralism, more Catholics, more Jews, more African Americans coming over, more Protestants who weren't from Britain. So the pluralism, but yet the majority white Protestants maintained these high aspirations that they were the protectors of American Christian heritage and that they were the builders of a distinctly Protestant society. And I chose the picture of Fanny Crosby, a woman of this time. She was a prolific hymn writer, even though she was blind. She was also a teacher and did rescue mission work. But this hymn of hers, Rescue the Perishing, and especially the refrain, just kind of is a nice emblem of the Protestants' aspiration as they carry on after the Civil War. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful. Jesus will save. All right. After the Civil War, the drive to spread the gospel grew even stronger. So the most well-known evangelist of the second half of the 19th century was D.L. Moody, and he was born in Massachusetts. So many things in Massachusetts. But he moved to Chicago as a young man. And he fits this new age, this changing age. He fits it well. So he's not as intense as Finney. He tried to talk sense into his audiences about God. He just spoke calmly and plainly and presented the basic gospel. He dressed like a conventional businessman. And it's interesting that in comparison to Finney, who was very much into social reform, D.L. Moody kind of turned away from the reform of society. He was just interested in individual salvation. He did speak about American concerns about the loss of traditional family and community values, which sounding more and more like evangelists that we might recognize. Unfortunately, one example of his compromise was that when he preached in the South, he was willing to segregate his meetings that he held in southern cities, Black people being segregated into separate seating. D.L. Moody founded a Bible training center for lay workers in Chicago, and that later became Moody Bible Institute. And he also started summer mission conferences that he held near his home in Northfield, Massachusetts. And from these meetings came the founding of something called the Student Volunteer Movement. And that was in 1876, the Student Volunteer Movement was started. And this group made a great effort to encourage thousands of students to seek the evangelization of the world in this generation. And one of the products of the student volunteer movement was John Mott, who wrote this book, The Evangelization of the World in This Generation. And he traveled all around, actually, he traveled around the world in America throughout his long life, talking about this mission that he described in this book. He really promoted the cause of missions. And the book pleaded with American Protestants to raise the number of their missionaries from 15,000 to 50,000, so that would be a way of achieving the goal stated in his book title, Evangelization of the World in This Generation. So huge, both evangelistic drive and also missionary drive in the second half of the 1800s. Unfortunately, during the last decades of the 19th century, this rise of Protestant missions from America was actually kind of entwined with America's expansionism. And this is just an example of the Philippines. A couple of quotes from an American president and an American senator during and after the war that the United States had with Spain for control of the Philippines in 1898. So President McKinley said about taking over the Philippines, there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and to uplift and civilize and Christianize them. So a combination, sort of a putting together of mission and territorial expansion. And then Senator Albert Beveridge said, God marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world. Okay, back to women for a minute. So this group, the Women's Foreign Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, this is just one example of women's missionary groups. And women were a major factor in this rising missionary interest. The participation of women was very key. And when denominations were hesitant about giving women full recognition as missionaries, women just created their own missionary societies, and they staffed them and they directed them and they funded them. And by the end of the 1800s, there were 41 women's missionary societies, and they supported over 1,200 missionaries. Here's a local example of the connection between women and missions. This is Mary Lyon, and she was the woman who founded Mount Holyoke Seminary in 1837 in South Hadley, Mass. And by 1887, 20% of the missionary women going out from the United States were Mount Holyoke alumni. And they were trained at Mount Holyoke to be teachers on the mission field, where the female teacher would be kind of like the female equivalent to the male preacher on the mission field. Okay. So we've got the missions, but at the same time, we have this drive to renovate society that stays alive, and it's a very strong force in American life in the 1800s. Most of the reformers felt that the key to changing society lay in converting individuals, but they also believed that changing society was part of that goal. One big part of the post-Civil War moral reform had to do with temperance, or a campaign against alcohol use or excessive alcohol use. And Frances Willard, pictured here, was the founder and the president of an organization, another one of those voluntary organizations, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And this is where women came together for social reform. And it started with the temperance, but it expanded to far more. It expanded to education, to women's rights, to moral reform of prostitutes, to women's right to vote, to labor reforms, to prison reforms, to global expansion of women's rights. And Frances Willard's motto for her organization was "Do everything." I love her. This was the most dynamic special purpose group for the purpose of reform at this time, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who were out to do everything. So this has been a whirlwind tour of an amazing century, the 19th century, or the Protestant century, we could call it, because the evangelical Protestants held so much influence and did so much for the conversion of individual people and for the reform of society. In 2 weeks, we're going to take another look at the 1800s, the 19th century, the Protestant century, but we're going to look through the lens of race, especially the Civil War and everything around the Civil War, before and after the Civil War. And then the week after that, we're going to go into the 20th century, and we're going to see Protestant influence and Protestant certainty be challenged in some serious ways, and see how Christianity responded. So I'll see you in 2 weeks.